The climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us that's not going to unite us.
On the other hand, it's becoming increasingly clear that there's a lot of strategic addition going on, but not much subtraction. But there still remain several competitions of interest between large and influential states.
And that puts the world at risk. People here in Washington forget that these economic or trade wars can very easily escalate into a hot war.
We've seen what's happened. We understand the way this conflict has begun.
2 decades of trends in conflict since the end of the Cold War have added types of conflict in which nuclear weapons are barely relevant, if at all relevant.
Many of your viewers think that we have here a new Cold War. I want to disappoint them. This is not a Cold War.
This is not a frozen conflict. This is a hot war.
It's a hot war.
These threats have added to the overall list of strategic concerns, but not without any of the more traditional threats necessarily being subtracted.
Is, if not the conviction, the concern that America is preparing war against Russia. If not in Syria, then on the 2 other Cold War fronts, Ukraine or the Baltic, where NATO is building up in an unprecedented way.
So hot wars are kind of an interesting subject because they've always happened in the world, and they're happening in the world now. We just saw Iran bomb about half of Saudi Arabia's oil facilities because we've got tariffs and embargoes and everything on Iran for them acting irresponsibly. So they go and blow something up because that's supposed to make it better. You know, we have for centuries upon centuries upon centuries fought each other over energy and food. Those are the 2 necessities for human beings, and that has everything to do with border lines, and how we interact beyond border lines has everything to do with food and energy. Nothing else matters. If you look at everything we've ever fought, the main purpose of every war we've been into has been over energy or food. That even goes for the Civil War here in the US. A lot of people think, you know, it was about tariffs, it was about freeing the slaves, but no, ultimately it was about controlling the agricultural South. The South didn't like what they were getting. It turned into a war. I mean, everything ultimately comes down to those basic necessities of human beings. Now, in a lot of my past videos, I've talked a bit about Russia and, you know, the historical relevance of the Great Grain Robbery, which is just, you know, a good example of how food can be weaponized. And again, you know, whether or not the Great Grain Robbery was a situation where Russia was weaponizing that or just trying to protect their people and make sure that they had plenty of food. You know, that's how a lot of these hot wars are, though. They're not necessarily meant to be malicious. Like Iran is a malicious example. The Great Grain Robbery with Russia is a very non-malicious example. When it comes to hot wars, you can find a lot of lessons from Russia. Now, after World War II, you had a lot of you had a Soviet Union, which was huge and encompassed a lot of smaller countries, but they were, you know, formed in a single big union, and they had a large amount of agricultural trade between them. It was almost a self-sustaining institution if you think about how they had this thing set up. And what's interesting is that in the 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and very rich agricultural countries like Georgia became insufficient on their own without those trade agreements. Without the Soviet Union, Georgia started having a very hard time with supplies. But yet they themselves are a very, very, very important agricultural country. They you know, raise cattle, they raise wine, they have a lot of agricultural products that come out of Georgia, but they don't have the grains and things that would have come out of, you know, Ukraine and Russia. So when they, as a part of the Soviet Union, they had access to all these things. But when the Soviet Union broke up and they were first out on their own, it was very tough for them, but eventually they adapted. Now, I think for Russia, in some ways, it was harder to adapt because nobody liked them. So it doesn't surprise you that in order to get back some of the agricultural goods and services that Russia had during the Soviet Union, they needed to start taking back some of those countries. And this is where, you know, some of the hot wars could seem to be a little more malicious. Russia went in and retook Georgia, I think it was in 2006 or 8, and it was a very quick takeover. They just kind of went in there and more or less commandeered the country. In doing so, they basically gave themselves back a very, very large, important agricultural diversity that they were missing when they lost Georgia as part of the Soviet Union. Yeah, fast forward a few more years, you have 2010 rolling around. Now, 2010 was also a relatively significant period of time because that is when Putin tried to upset the wheat market by not selling any of their wheat. But Russia alone, while they did raise wheat prices, they didn't have the dramatic impact on the global economy that I'm sure they were hoping to have. Now, again, you could chalk this up to, well, they were just trying to do the best thing for their wheat. But I think during that time, that was a test run to see how much they could offset or upset the global markets by withholding wheat. Because since that time, they've done something else. They've gone after Ukraine, which is the 6th largest producer of corn maize and a very large producer of wheat next to Russia. If you controlled the wheat of Russia and Ukraine, you could definitely cause a market crash by holding back grains. Another interest of Russia's lately has been the Arctic. And a lot of people think that the Arctic is all about oil and gas and minerals, which is why Trump wanted to buy Greenland. But also China is interested in the Arctic. A lot of people are interested in the Arctic. The Arctic is home to some of the most productive marine resources in the entire world. From halibut to shrimp, scallop, squid, pollock, crab, cod, Pacific salmon, and so much more. The Arctic is just flooded with marine resources and food resources. It is rich with resources. So when you see Trump wanting to buy Greenland, and you see Russia and NATO fighting over the Arctic, and you see China trying to move into the Arctic, all of this is not just over fossil fuels and energy resources. A lot of this is over the food resources. Now we see this also with the South China Sea. The South China Sea is one of the largest trade routes in the world. So is the Arctic, or potentially the Arctic. A lot of global warming people would like you to think that everything in the Arctic has to do with trade. It has more to do with resources than trade. The South China Sea, that has a lot to do with trade. Over 80% of trade goes through the South China Sea. Say 80%, 90% of trade is done over oceans, and 80% of that 90% is done in the South China Sea. Now, the South China Sea is also home to 1/10 of the world's marine resources, meaning fisheries, hatcheries, etc. The natural resources of the ocean, 1/10 of it is fished out of the South China Sea, which is why a lot of the disputes that you see in the South China Sea happen more with fishing boats than they do with oil tankers and than they do with trade. It's not just about the trade. China has tried to tell other countries when they can and cannot fish in the South China Sea. This has everything to do with food. You've heard me talk a lot about the food crisis here in the US, crop crisis, but this is something that's been going on around the world. In the Pan-Asian countries right now, you have an issue with rice. There are countries that are hoarding rice, and there are countries that are unable to Grow rice Indonesia has had a horrible crop season this year. The Philippines are having to supplement their markets with storage, rice storage that they've had, which means that there's not enough rice on the market. So they're having to flood the market with rice that they have stored, kept in reserves, in order to basically pull the price of rice back down so it's affordable and people can eat. In India, they've had a rough crop season, especially with the recent floods that were in India. And to make matters worse, and this is where food could be weaponized, anti-Indian militants in the Kashmir Valley have actually kept farmers from selling their apples to India. And this is a pretty big deal because 60% of the apples sold in India come from the Kashmir Valley. But these anti-government militants are preventing farmers from making those sales. It's bad for farmers, it's rotting apples when we need food, but it's also hurting who? India. Why? Because India has had a bad year of crops. I already talked earlier this year about how India had to raise tariffs in order to allow more imports of feed products for their animals. Now they're not getting fruits. These are people who are strategizing against India, know that India has a weakness, and so they're trying to cut off supplies. Apples are a very nutritious supply to a place like India. So I think a lot of people, focus on energy as the heart of conflict across the world, because since the 1970s, energy has kind of been it. But now that we're going into a minimum period, we're starting to see situations where people are weaponizing food, where there are food shortages, where people are actually strategically setting themselves up for global assets that have very rich food supplies. This isn't something that governments don't pay attention to. This is something that they're strategizing for on a daily basis. And yet, we have so many people oblivious to what's going on out there. And it's so easy to say, oh, well, the Arctic is about oil. Oh, well, the Arctic's about rare minerals. But the biggest resource of the Arctic is fisheries. The biggest conflict in the South China Sea, most of the conflicts occur between fishing boats, not, oil rigs. You do see some issues with oil rigs, but for the most part, what's going on are, you have these research vessels from China coming into an area and forcing out all the Philippine fishing boats. You have Chinese vessels running over fishing boats from Vietnam, from Thailand. They're just crushing each other over the fishing. This is about food. It's not just about energy anymore. Energy is in there. Yes, it's always been in there. But food has become a prominent source of conflict as a resource globally. And we're having crop losses globally, which should tell you something, that everybody knows that this solar minimum is causing a food crisis. The UN constantly talks about a food shortage while having to feed 10 billion people. UN is focused on food shortages around the world. So hot wars have already begun. Countries have already begun strategizing. They're already trying to take over growing zones. They're already trying to take over rich natural food sources. They're trying to expand their territories. Trump tried to buy Greenland. These aren't moves based on mineral rights. These are moves based on natural resources that have an abundance of supply. As people wake up and begin to realize what's happening, they are going to panic. Governments are trying to work ahead of that to keep people from panicking, to say, hey, we have the resources to feed our population. But as those resources get depleted, those hot wars will turn into real wars.
Now, one thing that we're all after is sustainability. I think that one of the things that we can learn from our past and going forward is that we have to be sustainable as units and not as larger groups. Self-sustainability is about learning to be sustainable as a unit, as a self, or as a community. And that is how you get through long periods of time where there are disruptions in crops and things like that. Just because there's disruptions in big ag, or disruptions in large crop production, or disruptions in large meat production doesn't mean that it has to be disruptive to each individual. You have the ability, you have the senses, you have the knowledge to be self-sufficient. Ultimately, whether you are somebody who is fundamentally grounded that the climate is controlled by the sun and the moon, the stars, our planet, Mother Nature, or you're somebody who believes that the climate is controlled by man-made global warming, the answer in every situation is to become more self-sufficient. It's really not that complicated. It's not that hard to achieve that, but it does take time. So these are things that you need to start prepping for now. Our governments are already prepping the battlefield, so to speak, for resources. You, as an individual, should be doing it for yourself, and then your community.